It was the spring of 1944. The war had already changed everything, every face, every night sky, every sound in the air. In the darkness above Europe, the engines of German fighters roared, their pilots confident, almost calm. For years the Luftwaffe had ruled those skies. They believed they knew every shape that dared to fly toward them, until one night something new appeared. A flash of silver cutting through the clouds. A streak faster than they had ever seen. And before anyone could react, it was gone. The pilots radioed in, confused, their voices shaking. "What was that?" one of them said. The answer would come weeks later, whispered across airfields. "It's the Mustang. The American Mustang. And now, it's faster." They didn't know yet what had changed. The airframe was the same, the wings familiar. But something inside that machine had evolved. Something invisible. It wasn't a new weapon or a secret alloy. It was fuel. High-octane, 150-grade fuel, born from chemistry, desperation, and the race to survive. For the men who lived through it, this wasn't just engineering, it was life itself. When you're thousands of meters above the earth, every drop of gasoline, every spark, every vibration of the engine decides whether you live to see another dawn. And when that fuel changed, the entire rhythm of air combat changed with it. The P-51 Mustang had already earned respect. It was fast, reliable, and could fly deep into enemy territory. But with the arrival of 150-grade fuel, something happened that no one expected. The Rolls-Royce Merlin engine inside could suddenly breathe deeper. It could run at higher pressures without tearing itself apart. That meant more power, more speed, and a climb rate that shocked even its own pilots. In official tests, when that new fuel was introduced, the Mustang's speed increased by nearly 15 miles per hour across most altitudes. It doesn't sound like much on paper. But in a dogfight, 15 miles per hour can mean the difference between life and death. Between catching your enemy or being caught yourself. Pilots said the change was instant. They could feel it in the throttle. The engine's roar was deeper, fuller, more alive. It was as if the aircraft itself had grown confident. One pilot said later, "When we opened up the boost with that fuel, you could feel her wake up." The Mustang became something else. The Germans noticed too. They called it the Silver Ghost. It appeared out of nowhere, attacked with impossible speed, and vanished into the clouds. They tried to explain it, perhaps new propellers, new superchargers, new tactics. But no, it was chemistry. It was the quiet victory of fuel over fear. To understand this, you have to imagine what flight meant in those years. Engines didn't forgive mistakes. Too much heat, and the pistons would melt. Too much pressure, and the block would explode. The higher you climbed, the thinner the air, and the weaker your power became. Pilots learned to listen to their engines like doctors to a heartbeat. Every knock, every sputter, every tremor was a warning. The new fuel changed that heartbeat. With 150 grade, the Merlin engine could handle boost pressures that would have destroyed it before. At 75 inches of manifold pressure, it produced up to 1,700 horsepower. Enough to push the Mustang past 440 miles per hour. In some bursts, during dives or emergency climbs, even higher. The Allies didn't just build better planes. They built better fuel. Factories in Britain and America refined thousands of barrels with special additives, lead, toluene, iso-octane, everything to prevent detonation. That was the true secret. Not speed from design, but endurance from chemistry. It took engineers, chemists, and ordinary workers who never left the ground, but whose hands changed the sky. Imagine them. Men and women in overalls, sleeves rolled, faces smudged with oil, mixing the lifeblood of war in steel drums and tankers. Most would never see the planes that drank their fuel. But their work was felt in every engine roar, in every returning pilot. By the summer of '44, squadrons across the 8th Air Force began switching to the new grade. Mechanics recalibrated carburetors, checked spark plugs, adjusted boost controls. The change wasn't easy. Engines ran hotter. Maintenance crews worked longer hours, testing, retesting, afraid of catastrophic failures. But soon the results spoke louder than any report. The Mustangs were faster, sharper, deadlier. And Germany noticed the difference. For the Luftwaffe, it was the beginning of the end. Their best pilots, many of them veterans since 1939, found themselves outclimbed and outpaced. They still fought with courage, but courage could not change physics. Their fuel, degraded by shortages and bombing of refineries, couldn't match Allied quality. Even their newest aircraft, the Focke-Wulf 190 and the Messerschmitt 109, struggled to keep up in sustained engagements. They would dive, attack, and retreat, but the Mustang could follow. The skies above Europe turned into a vast, invisible laboratory of speed and endurance. Every sortie tested the limits of man and machine. Some pilots described the sensation like flying with fate itself. One wrong move, one misfire, and the earth would rise to meet you in seconds. But when everything worked, it was like flying with wings of fire. That's what the Germans didn't expect. They thought the Americans had built a new aircraft, not a new heartbeat. They didn't realize the true weapon was invisible, hidden in the shimmer of gasoline inside the fuel lines. The 150-grade fuel became the quiet revolution of the air war. Reports from Allied testing grounds confirm it. At high altitude, the Mustang gained not just speed but time. Time to climb. Time to escape. Time to protect the bombers it escorted. For every bomber that returned safely, there was a Mustang pilot, engine howling, pushing that Merlin past its limits. And every time the fuel burned clean and true, it meant one more man lived to see home. The Germans had their own innovations. Jets, rockets, desperate designs built in the ruins of their factories. But they came too late, too few, and too fragile. The Mustang was not the fastest plane of the war on paper. But it was the most balanced, the most reliable, the most trusted. It was the plane that could go anywhere, fight anyone, and come back. Sometimes progress doesn't look like invention. Sometimes it's a change so small that only those who lived it understand its weight. A new grade of fuel. A new limit in the engine's heart. And suddenly the war shifts. I've read the pilots' letters. Some were written from airfields in England, on damp nights when the engines cooled under the stars. They didn't speak of victory, they spoke of exhaustion, of fear, of missing home. They weren't fighting for glory. They were fighting to survive. One wrote, "The sound of the engine at full boost, it's the loneliest sound in the world. Because you know what it means. You're running for your life." That's the voice I remember when I think about the Mustang. Not the machine itself, but the people behind it. The ones who filled it, fixed it, and flew it. The ones who watched from the ground as it disappeared into the horizon. They didn't know if it would return. The war would end as all wars do, in silence. Engines shut down. Hangars emptied. The smell of fuel faded from the airfields. But the memory remained. Of that moment when chemistry met courage. When men discovered that even in war, progress can come from understanding, not destruction. The Germans never expected that fuel could turn the tide. But it did. It turned ordinary engines into weapons of precision. It turned pilots into legends. And it reminded the world that sometimes, the smallest drop can change the course of history. Even now, when you stand beside a restored Mustang and hear the rumble of its Merlin engine, it still sounds alive. As if the ghosts of those who flew it are still somewhere up there, riding the wind, chasing the horizon. Not as soldiers anymore, but as memories. Free. They say wars are fought by men but won by ideas. And sometimes, those ideas come from the quietest rooms, places far from the front lines where no gunfire can be heard. In one of those rooms, engineers and chemists worked under dim lamps, surrounded by charts, equations, and the faint smell of gasoline. They were not soldiers. They did not carry rifles. But they were fighting all the same. One of them once said, "If we can make the fuel burn cleaner, the engine will give more than it was ever designed for." It sounded simple, almost poetic. But behind those words lay months of sleepless nights, failed experiments, and explosions that shook the ground. High-octane fuel was not just a discovery, it was a battle against the limits of matter itself. The British had begun it years earlier, working with the Americans. They studied anti-knock agents, ways to let engines run hotter and harder without tearing themselves apart. The answer was lead. Tiny drops of tetraethyl lead mixed into gasoline allowed compression to rise, pressures to increase, and the very heart of the Merlin engine to grow stronger. When combined with new refining processes, this led to the creation of fuels that could endure what was once unthinkable. Those who worked in refineries rarely saw headlines. But their work echoed through the clouds of Europe. Each barrel sent to an airfield was a promise. This fuel will not fail you. It will carry you home. When the 100 out of 150 grade was first delivered to the squadrons, mechanics looked at the drums with caution. It smelled sharper, more metallic. They'd heard rumors. Some said it could make the engine overheat, others said it would melt spark plugs. But the engineers were confident. They had tested it under fire, in the roaring heat of test stands, watching the gauges climb into the red. The engines held. The fuel burned smooth. Soon pilots took off with the new blend. The results were immediate. Climb rates shortened. Interceptions became easier. For bomber crews, that meant fewer empty seats on the way back. At high altitude, where air thinned and frost crept across cockpit glass, the Mustang now kept its strength. German interceptors, once dominant in the thin blue edge above 25,000 feet, found their prey harder to catch. The P-51 could now escort bombers all the way to Berlin and back. That was the difference, the bridge between survival and loss. Imagine a formation of B-17s, engines droning, bombs heavy under their wings. Ahead of them, a line of silver fighters flashes in the sun. The Mustangs. Their wings are clean, their engines singing at full power. Somewhere below, German radar stations light up, voices calling out bearings. Messerschmitts climb to intercept. And then, in a moment that repeats across countless missions, they meet. A German pilot pushes his throttle forward. His 109 shakes slightly, the needle trembling near its limits. He's done this before, countless times. But this time the American doesn't fall behind. He stays, matches him turn for turn, dive for dive. The German curses under his breath. His gauges flicker red. He pulls out, barely avoiding a stall. And in his rear mirror, the silver Mustang follows. What changed? A few octane numbers. A small shift in chemistry. But in war, such small things decide everything. Reports began to circulate among Luftwaffe squadrons. Pilots described the Mustangs as faster, more persistent, more aggressive. One intelligence note written by a German officer in mid-1944 warned that Allied aircraft were showing unusually high engine performance, particularly at altitude. He didn't know the reason, but he could feel its consequences every time he flew. Meanwhile, back in England, the airfields buzzed with movement. The smell of fuel, wet grass, and metal hung in the air. Crews in heavy jackets walked between aircraft, their boots crunching on gravel. Engines started one by one, coughing, then roaring alive. The ground trembled. The sky filled with sound. Each pilot carried more than a machine. He carried the work of thousands. The chemists, the machinists, the men in refineries, the women who packed tools and turned bolts. Every spark, every cylinder firing in rhythm, was their contribution to victory. But the Mustangs were not invincible. Engines still failed. Pilots still vanished into smoke and silence. The new fuel gave them speed, not immortality. And many who flew it never saw what their efforts achieved. In the months that followed, air superiority slowly shifted. The Luftwaffe, strained by losses and shortages, struggled to defend its skies. German refineries were burning, railways shattered, fuel reserves shrinking. Their pilots were brave, but bravery without gasoline is only air. By late 1944, many German aircraft were grounded, waiting for shipments that never came. The Allies had turned technology into logistics and logistics into strategy. The Mustang became a symbol of that precision, a fighter that could fly farther, fight longer, and finish what it started. Historians later called it the perfect plane. But perfection is an illusion. The truth is simpler, more human. It was a machine built by people who refused to give up. Each improvement was a story of failure and persistence. Each success was paid for with risk. The 150-grade fuel was not born from comfort. It was born from necessity. Without it, the bombers might never have reached their targets. Without it, the air war could have dragged on longer, costing countless more lives. It was, in every sense, a silent weapon. And when the war finally began to tilt, when German cities grew dark under Allied raids, when the horizon over Europe burned with the last glow of conflict, the Mustangs were there. They escorted the bombers home. They met the jets of the future and survived them. And when the guns fell silent, many of those planes were left standing on quiet airfields, their wings streaked with oil, their pilots staring at the dawn, unsure what to do with peace. The men who had once fought for every breath at 20,000 feet now walked among the still machines. They touched the metal, still warm from the last flight. They looked at the drums of unused fuel and wondered how something so ordinary had carried them through hell. One of them said years later, "The war ended when the engines stopped. But I still hear them sometimes in my sleep." That's how memory works. It doesn't fade. It hums quietly like a Merlin cooling after battle. The Germans never expected it. They had built faster planes before, better guns, stronger armor. But they couldn't imagine that victory might come from the chemistry of a single barrel of gasoline. That was the genius of the Mustang. Its strength came not from invention alone, but from everything behind it. When I close my eyes, I can still see it. The silver wings catching the morning sun. The trail of vapor stretching across a sky that once belonged to fear. And the sound of an engine that refused to quit. It wasn't just a machine. It was a promise. That speed could serve life, not just destroy it. That knowledge, even born in war, could become a step toward peace. They said the Mustang had a soul. Maybe that was just a way of coping with fear, but when you were inside it, alone with the sky, it felt alive. Every vibration through the stick, every tremor of the engine, it spoke to you. Pilots didn't just fly these machines. They became part of them. I've listened to veterans talk about that sound, the high-pitched hum of the Merlin, the whistle as the air sliced past the canopy, the low, steady heartbeat when the plane was trimmed just right. They said it was music, a song that meant life. Because as long as you could hear it, you were still in control. When the 150 grade fuel came, that song changed. It grew sharper, louder, more confident. The Mustang no longer just flew, it leapt. At full throttle, the cockpit shook with controlled fury. You could feel the power pressing against your back as if the plane wanted to break free from gravity itself. Many of those pilots were barely 20. They were farm boys, mechanics, students. They had seen the war only in newsreels before stepping into it. And yet, in those few square meters of metal and glass, they carried the fate of cities. Some were terrified every time they took off. Some pretended not to be. But none of them were immune to the weight of what they were doing. I remember reading one pilot's diary. He wrote, "The smell of the new fuel stays in your clothes. It burns sweet. When I climb, I can feel her pushing harder than she used to. The Germans don't understand. They think we got new planes. But it's the same girl. Just stronger now." That's how they spoke about the Mustangs, like partners. Not machines, but companions that shared danger. For the ground crews, it was no less personal. They worked through rain and wind, tightening bolts with numb hands, their sleeves soaked with fuel and sweat. They called the mechanics the guardians. Because before a pilot trusted his life to the sky, he trusted it to them. One of the chief engineers, writing years later, said, "We learned to treat the Merlin like a living thing. She'd tell you when she was angry, when she was tired, when she needed rest." And that's exactly what they did. Listened, adjusted, coaxed every last ounce of power from her without breaking her heart. Those were the people who truly made the Mustang what it was. They didn't wear medals, and most of their names are lost in faded reports. But when a pilot came back alive, it was their victory too. The Germans, meanwhile, were running out of time. Fuel shortages forced them to train new pilots on bicycles, pretending to dogfight in the open air because real gasoline was too precious to waste. Some Messerschmitts took off with only enough fuel for 20 minutes of flight. They would fight, land, refuel, and go again until both man and machine were exhausted. Against that, the Mustangs seemed endless. They arrived in numbers the Luftwaffe could no longer match. Their range meant there was no place left to hide. Even the mighty Me-262 jet, Germany's miracle weapon, struggled to operate safely when the skies were full of these escorts waiting to strike during takeoff or landing. But this story isn't about victory alone. It's about what it cost. For every mission that returned, another did not. Engines failed. Wings broke under stress. Men vanished into clouds that swallowed them whole. Sometimes the wreckage was found weeks later, twisted metal glinting in a field of flowers. Sometimes it was never found at all. When you listen to those who survived, they don't speak about glory. They speak about the silence after landing. About the empty bunks. About the smell of burned oil that lingered long after the fight was over. That's the truth of war. Even progress comes at a price no one can truly afford. But still they kept flying. Because by then the Mustang had become more than a weapon. It was a symbol of endurance. It meant that even in a world tearing itself apart, people could still build something beautiful, something that worked, something that gave hope. The German pilots knew it too. Some of them wrote in captured letters that they respected the Mustang pilots. That the fights were cleaner than the chaos on the ground. In the air there was at least a strange kind of honor. Two men, two machines, both doing their best to survive the storm history had thrown them into. In those final months, the skies above Europe turned into a graveyard of smoke and sunlight. Engines burned bright against the cold blue. Contrails twisted together like threads of fate. And through it all, the Mustangs roared, unstoppable, undeniable. The secret wasn't magic. It was mathematics, chemistry, courage, and loss. It was what happens when knowledge is pushed to its absolute edge and then just a little further. That's where human beings are at their most dangerous, and their most brilliant. When the war finally began to crumble, when the enemy cities fell quiet, and the airfields emptied one by one, the Mustangs stood lined up in silence. Some were scrapped. Some were shipped home. Some were left behind, rusting under foreign skies. Their engines cooled, their wings collected dust, but their legacy was alive long after the war ended. Years later, the same men who had once fought in them would meet again, not as soldiers but as old friends. They'd gather at air shows, gray-haired now, their voices trembling with age. And when one of those old planes started up again, they'd fall silent. The engine would cough, sputter, and then, just like before, roar to life. A sound that shook the earth and the heart in equal measure. Some of them cried. Not for victory, but for memory, for the youth they had left in those skies, for the friends who never came back. The Mustang was a machine, yes, but in its story lived something eternal, the idea that even in the darkest hours, innovation and courage can still lift humanity upward. The Germans never expected it. How could they? How could anyone imagine that chemistry, the invisible art of refining fuel, could change the course of a war? But it did. It turned numbers on a laboratory chart into power under a pilot's hand. It turned science into survival. It turned ordinary men into legends. That's what the world learned from the skies of 1944. That even when nations fall and cities burn, the pursuit of knowledge, pure, relentless knowledge, can still light a path forward. When the war finally ended, the world exhaled. The guns stopped first, then the engines. For a moment there was silence. A silence so deep that even the wind felt strange. Men who had spent years with the roar of engines in their ears suddenly heard only the beating of their own hearts. It was over. And yet, for those who had lived in the sky, the world below felt too still. The airfields that once shook with takeoffs now smelled of rust and rain. Rows of Mustangs stood under gray clouds, their propellers tied down, their wings heavy with dust. Some still carried the marks of battle, patched holes, faded paint, names written by hands that would never return. The war was gone, but its echoes remained in the hangars, in the smell of oil, in the ghosts that lingered inside every cockpit. Pilots walked among them quietly. They ran their hands across the metal, tracing dents like scars. They remembered each flight, each friend, each moment when they thought it would be their last. They didn't see machines. They saw memories frozen in aluminum and rivets. They saw the lives that fuel had carried across the sky. For the scientists and engineers, the war ended differently. Their notebooks were full of numbers, their drawings stained with coffee and smoke. They had built engines that screamed louder than thunder and fuels that burned hotter than fire. Now they were told to stop, to turn that knowledge toward peace. Some did. They built airliners, teaching the world to fly for pleasure instead of survival. Others joined the dawn of a new race, the race for the stars. But for a time they all remembered what it had felt like to push past the limits of nature itself. To stand in a control room as a test engine reached its breaking point. To watch the needles climb into the red and not look away. They had seen what human will could do when the world demanded the impossible. The 150-grade fuel, once a military secret, became a chapter in textbooks. Historians wrote about it with calm detachment, calling it a technical advancement. But those who lived through it knew better. It wasn't just chemistry. It was a heartbeat. It was the difference between despair and hope, between never coming back and landing safely at dawn. Even decades later, when people saw the old footage, Mustangs banking above the clouds, sunlight flashing off their wings, they could feel it. That mix of courage and fear, of beauty born in destruction. The war had taken millions, but it had also shown what humanity could build when pushed beyond breaking. The very fuel that once fed combat would later feed progress. In the 1950s and 60s, that same understanding of high-octane combustion found new life in jet propulsion and rocket design. What began as a way to survive became a way to explore. From the roar of the Mustang's Merlin engine came, indirectly, the whisper of spacecraft engines igniting above the Earth. The line between war and discovery blurred, but the lesson remained: knowledge itself is neutral. It is people who choose how to use it. And yet, even as technology moved forward, the memory of the Mustang stayed. At air shows, children would cover their ears as the engine started, the same deep rumble that once filled the skies of Europe. Old men in faded uniforms would stand straighter, their eyes wet with memory. They didn't see a machine from the past. They saw the youth they had left behind, the friends who never came home. Some Mustangs were rebuilt and flown again. Their wings gleamed in the sun, their propellers cutting through time itself. When one of them lifted off, the crowd always fell silent. Because for a few seconds, history lived again. The same sound that once meant survival now meant remembrance. It was proof that even in war, humans had created something that refused to die. The Germans who had fought against them felt it too. Years later, some met their former enemies. They shook hands, exchanged stories, laughed softly about how young they had been. They talked not of hatred but of respect, of the strange shared understanding that comes from having faced the same sky. They spoke of the moment they first saw the silver Mustangs diving through the clouds, moving faster than anything they had known. And they admitted quietly that they had been afraid. That is how history heals. Not through forgetting but through remembering together. Through recognizing that even those who fought on opposite sides were bound by the same hunger for life, the same awe before the power of flight. The world changed after that. The next generation grew up under peaceful skies, not knowing what it meant to count seconds between explosions. But somewhere above them, the ghosts of those planes still flew. Invisible, weightless, eternal. Because stories like these do not end when the war does. They continue in the hum of every engine, in every contrail that fades slowly against the sunset. They continue in the eyes of those who look up and feel something they can't quite name, a mix of sorrow and pride, of loss and wonder. The Germans never expected it. They thought the war would be won by weapons alone. They couldn't imagine that the true turning point would come from a small, invisible change in the heart of a machine. But that's how history works. It turns on the quietest moments, on the smallest discoveries, on the courage of people who never asked for glory but found it anyway. The Mustang and its 150-grade fuel were never just tools of war. They were proof that progress is possible even when everything around you is falling apart. That human ingenuity, once awakened, doesn't die with conflict. It transforms. It builds bridges, rockets, dreams. And so, when we remember that silver fighter cutting through the sky, we remember not just a plane but an idea. That knowledge, when used with courage, can lift us above the darkest storms. Time passed. The noise faded. What once filled the skies with thunder now rests quietly in museums, in hangars, and in the fragile hearts of those who still remember. The world moved on, but memory doesn't obey time. It lingers, soft, persistent, alive in the hum of an old propeller, in the smell of oil on cold metal, in the trembling hands of men who once flew through hell. The Mustang became a legend not because of its victories, but because of the people who believed in it. The engineers who looked at an ordinary machine and saw potential. The mechanics who trusted their work enough to let others fly. The pilots who climbed into those cockpits knowing that every takeoff might be their last. They weren't chasing glory. They were keeping a promise, to protect, to endure, to come home if they could. When you look at the P-51 today standing still under museum lights, you might see only metal and rivets. But if you listen carefully, there's more. There's the echo of engines that once tore the night apart. There's laughter between missions, fear before dawn, and the silence after the last sortie. There's the memory of a time when the world was divided, and men tried to hold on to hope one flight at a time. The 150-grade fuel, the miracle that made the Mustang faster, stronger, deadlier, was eventually replaced, forgotten by most. But it remains a symbol of what people can do when necessity pushes them past the edge. It was never just a chemical formula. It was determination distilled into liquid form. It was courage turned into motion. It was proof that even the smallest discovery can rewrite the balance of history. In the end, that's what the war taught us. That technology and humanity are inseparable. That behind every machine is a heartbeat. Behind every advancement, a name. Behind every victory, a loss. The German pilots who once feared the Mustangs lived long enough to tell their side. Some met their former enemies at reunions decades later. They spoke softly, their voices full of peace, as if the years themselves had forgiven them. They didn't talk about enemies anymore. They talked about flying, about the beauty of it, the terror, the freedom. They talked about the smell of the air at 20,000 feet, about the sunrise above the clouds, about how small the world looked from up there. And they all said the same thing. They were just boys who wanted to live. History often reduces such things to numbers. Altitudes, speeds, losses, victories. But the truth lives between the lines. It lives in the trembling of a hand lighting a cigarette after landing. It lives in the way a mechanic whispered, "Come back safe," when tightening the last bolt. It lives in the photograph tucked into the instrument panel, in the lucky coin in a pilot's pocket, in the smell of burned fuel that stayed on their skin for years. When you hear the Mustang's engine today, it doesn't sound like war. It sounds like memory, like something sacred trying not to fade. The same roar that once meant danger now carries gratitude. It reminds us of what we lost, and what we learned, because progress without memory is nothing. And the people who built those machines, who refined that fuel, who risked everything for a sky they might never return from, they left behind more than a victory. They left behind a lesson. That knowledge can be a weapon or a gift. That courage is not the absence of fear, but the will to act despite it. That even in the darkest chapters of our history, there are sparks of light that refuse to die. The Mustang was one of those sparks. Born in a time of despair, it rose to become a symbol of resilience. And the men who flew it carried that light across a broken world. Every time the engine roared, it said the same thing. We are still here. We will not give up. We will rise again. Now, when the last of those pilots sit quietly by the window watching the sunset, they sometimes hear it again, the faint rumble of a Merlin far above. A sound that belongs to their youth, to their courage, to everything they were. And in that moment they smile. Because they know that somewhere beyond the clouds, the ghosts of their comrades are still flying. Not in war, not in fear, but in peace. In endless, open skies. The Germans never expected that a simple change in fuel could rewrite the heavens. But it did. And the world has been climbing higher ever since. If you're still here, thank you. You're the kind of person who doesn't just watch history. You feel it. You understand that behind every engine, every photo, every name, there were real people. People who lived, fought, and dreamed of peace. The stories like this touch you. If you believe that remembering matters, then don't just scroll away. Subscribe. Because this isn't just another channel. It's a place where the past still speaks. Where we remember not for clicks, but because someone has to keep these voices alive. Every new story we tell. Every forgotten pilot, every hidden truth. It all starts with you being here. So hit that button. Stay with us. And let's keep these stories flying. For them. For history. For all of us.